They had crossed China, they had broken the Philippines, and for one terrible year, no line of men had ever held against them. On the black sand at the mouth of Alligator Creek, just past 1 o'clock in the morning, on August 21st, 1942, more than 900 Japanese soldiers rose from the jungle and began to run. They came screaming a single word into the dark, bayonets fixed, certain that fear alone would sweep the Americans into the sea. It had always worked before, but the young Marines waiting behind that thin ridge had something the Imperial Army had never seen: a cannon built to kill tanks, loaded that night with a shell that held 122 steel balls, each one the size of a marble, packed tight and waiting to spread like buckshot from hell. The gunners had been ordered not to fire, not yet, to wait until the screaming men were close enough to touch. What happened in the next 4 minutes would shatter a myth that had terrified the Pacific and change the way this war was fought. This is the story of the night. The Banzai charge met American steel, and the men on both sides, who never forgot the sound it made. The rain had stopped an hour before midnight, but the jungle still wept. Water slid from the broad leaves and fell in slow drops onto the helmets of the Marines dug in along the western bank of Alligator Creek. The air was thick enough to drink, heavy with the smell of salt, rotting vegetation, and the faint, sour trace of men who had not been dry in weeks, somewhere out in the darkness, past the sandbar where the creek met the sea. The enemy was moving. You could not see them. You could only feel them, the way you feel a storm before the first thunder. Captain John Hightower crouched behind a low mud ridge and listened. He was 31 years old, a Marine artillery officer from a small town in Tennessee, and he had learned long ago that the jungle told you things if you were patient enough to hear them. The birds had gone quiet. The insects had stopped their endless singing. Even the drip of water from the branches seemed to hold its breath. In the stillness, Hightower heard something that did not belong, a whisper of voices, far off and low, speaking a language that was not English. Beside him sat the reason he had not slept in 2 days. A squat, ugly weapon, no taller than a man's waist. Its long barrel pointed east across the sandbar toward the black wall of the jungle. The 37-millimeter anti-tank gun. It had been shipped halfway around the world to punch holes through the armor of Japanese tanks. But there were almost no tanks on Guadalcanal. There was only mud and Jungler and men, hundreds of thousands of men who wanted to kill each other. Hightower had spent weeks turning his tank killer into something else, something the manuals barely mentioned. Sergeant Eddie McCullough knelt the brace, checking the mechanism for the third time in 10 minutes. He was a quiet man in his late 20s, a former artillery instructor who had trained gun crews back in the States before he ever heard the word Guadalcanal. His hands moved without his eyes, feeling the cold steel, testing the lever, making certain that when the moment came, the gun would not fail. McCullough did not pray. He checked his equipment. That was his prayer. Loaded in the breech was not the armor-piercing shell. The gun was built to fire. It was a canister round. The M2, on the outside, it looked like an ordinary shell. Inside, packed tight in a thin metal case, weighted 122 steel balls, each one machined to the size of a marble. When the gun fired, the case would burst apart just past the muzzle and throw those steel balls forward in a spreading cone, like the blast of the largest shotgun ever built. It was an old idea wearing new clothes. 80 years before, at places like Gettysburg, cannons had torn apart charging men with grape shot. McCullough had studied those battles. He understood exactly what this weapon could do to human flesh, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. Behind the gun, in a shallow trench, crouched Private Miller. He was barely 20 years old, and he could load the gun blindfolded. He had practiced the sequence until his hands knew it better than his mind did, until he could chamber a round in the dark by feel alone. Miller did not fully understand yet what those steel balls would do. He only knew his job: open the breech, seat the round, clear the way, again and again and again, as fast as a man could move. 3 men, 1 gun, and a thin line of tired Marines. Against them, gathering in the jungle, wasserlegend. For a year, the Japanese soldier had seemed unstoppable. From the plains of China to the jungles of the Philippines, they had used a tactic that broke armies and shattered nerves. The Banzai charge, a human wave of screaming men rushing forward through the night, bayonets fixed, willing, eager to die for their emperor. Superior firepower meant nothing. The stories said, when 1,000 men who did not fear death came at you all at once through the dark. Every Marine on the island had heard those stories. Some of them had begun to believe them. 2 miles to the west, in the dripping blackness of the jungle, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki was making a decision that would kill almost every man under his command. Ichiki was a proud officer, a veteran, a man who had built his career on the belief that spirit could overcome steel. He had been ordered to Guadalcanal to retake the airfield the Americans had seized, the airfield they now called Henderson Field. His detachment numbered close to 920 men in this first assault force, hardened soldiers of the Imperial Army. His orders had been to wait, to gather his full strength, to let the rest of his troops and his supporting weapons come ashore before he struck. But Ichiki did not wait. He had crushed enemies before with less. He believed the Americans were soft, that they had never truly faced the fury of a Japanese charge, that his men could sweep across the sandbar and break the Marine line in a single night before dawn ever touched the sky. Waiting felt like weakness to him. Waiting felt like doubt, and so he chose to attack at once with only the men he had, trusting that the fighting spirit of his soldiers would be enough. It was a decision made from pride, and it would become one of the most fatal mistakes of the entire Pacific campaign. His men prepared in the darkness. They fixed their bayonets to their rifles. Some smeared charcoal on their faces to blend with the night. They carried little, only their weapons, a few grenades, and enough ammunition to break through. Speed was everything. Once they shattered the American line, they would take what they needed from the dead. Their officers moved among them, whispering, steadying, reminding them of who they were and what they had always done. In China, entire enemy divisions had fled at the mere sight of these men charging with cold steel. Tonight would be no different. Tonight the Americans would learn to fear them too. Across the creek, Hightower gave a low order down the line. Hold your fire. Nobody shoots until I say. The words passed from man to man in the dark. A whisper carried on breath alone. He wanted the enemy close. He needed them close. The canister round was a weapon of terrible intimacy, fired too soon. At too great a distance, the steel balls would spread thin and lose their bite. Fired at the right moment, when the charging men had funneled onto the narrow sandbar and packed together in their fury, one shell could cut down everything in a fan 200 feet wide. So they would wait. They would let the screaming come to them. McCullough settled behind the gun and set his eye to the sight. His breathing slowed. He thought, for just a moment, of the wooden targets they had shredded in practice, the way the steel balls had chewed through them like paper. Then he pushed the thought away. Miller pressed himself flat against the wall of his trench, one hand resting on the next round, ready to move the instant McCullough called for it. Hightower stared out into the black, counting his own heartbeats. feeling the weight of every man's life along that ridge settle onto his shoulders. The jungle noises had stopped completely now. No birds, no insects, nothing but the soft rush of the sea against the sand and the distant, growing murmur of hundreds of men working themselves toward the edge. Then the murmur became a sound, low at first, a rumble that seemed to rise out of the ground itself, and then climbing, sharpening, resolving into voices, human voices, hundreds of them, chanting together in the dark. The Marines along the ridge gripped their rifles tighter down the line. A young private whispered a prayer his mother had taught him. Machine gunners eased off their safeties. Mortar crews checked their ranges one final time, and out on the far side of the sandbar, dark shapes began to spill from the tree line. They no longer tried to hide. The time for hiding was over. They came out into the open, rank upon rank, a mass of men that seemed to have no end, moving toward the creek, toward the ridge, toward the three men and their strange waiting gun. Hightower's mouth had gone dry. He watched them come, and he did not give the order, not yet. Every instinct screamed at him to fire, to do something, anything, against that oncoming tide. But he held because he understood what McCullough understood. The weapon in front of him had been built to kill machines. In the next few minutes it would be asked to do something far worse and far more decisive than anything its designers had ever imagined. The screaming men were closing the distance. Now 200 yards, 180. The sandbar was funneling them together exactly as Hightower had prayed. It would, packing the charge into a tight and terrible column of flesh. He wrapped his fingers around the cold edge of the ridge and waited for the range to close. Behind him, McCullough's finger rested light against the trigger, and in the darkness ahead, 900 men who believed they could not be stopped ran headlong toward a lesson that would echo across the rest of the war. 150 yards. The charging mass had crossed onto the open sand now, and the starlight caught the thin blades of their bayonets, 1,000 small glints, rising and falling as they ran. The chanting had become a single word, screamed over and over, until it lost all meaning and became pure sound. A wall of noise rolling across the water toward the ridge. Captain John Hightower felt it in his chest, in his teeth, in the hollow of his stomach. Fear was a living thing on that sandbar, and it moved in both directions. McCullough did not blink. His eye stayed fixed to the sight. His world narrowed to the notch of steel and the dark tide beyond it. He had chosen his moment weeks ago. In his mind, on a wooden training range under a Carolina sun, 120 yards. That was where the cone of steel would be tight enough, fast enough, wide enough, not before he counted the closing distance, the way another man might count the last seconds of his own life. 140, 130, down the Marine line, a machine gun opened up. It could not wait any longer. Red tracers reached out across the sand and cut into the front rank of the charge, and men fell, but the gaps closed the instant they opened. The rear ranks pressed forward over the bodies of the fallen without breaking stride, without slowing, without any sign that death meant anything to them at all. To the young Marines watching, it was the stuff of nightmares. You could kill them, and they simply kept coming. The stories had been true. The stories had not been enough. Hightower opened his mouth. The range was almost there. He could see faces now in the muzzle flashes of the machine gun, mouths stretched wide, eyes bright and empty, men who had already died in their own hearts and had come here only to take others with them. 120 yards, fire. Hightower said. McCullough squeezed the trigger. The 37-millimeter gun slammed backward against its recoil mechanism with a crack that split the night in two For one white instant, the muzzle flash lit the whole sandbar. And Hightower saw them, hundreds of faces frozen in that flash of light, running full speed into the dark. Then the canister case burst apart just past the barrel and threw 122 steel balls forward in a spreading cone, each one traveling at nearly 1,500 feet per second toward the packed column of charging men. What happened next did not look like war. It looked like something older and more terrible. The center of the charge simply came apart. Men who had been running at full speed vanished, torn down by 3 and 4 steel balls at once. Their bodies opened and flung sideways into the sand. The cone of destruction carved a gap 30 yards wide through the front of the column, and for one heartbeat there was a hole where a wall of men had been. Those who were struck did not cry out. There was no time. Their momentum carried them a few more feet, and then they folded and fell. And the men behind them ran into the sudden emptiness and did not understand what had happened to their comrades. Miller was already moving. The spent case clattered to the ground beside the gun, ejected by the semi-automatic breech, still smoking. His gloved hands found the next round, seated it, cleared the way, and slapped McCullough's shoulder to tell him it was ready. He did it in the dark, by feel, exactly as he had drilled it 1,000 times. He did not look at the sandbar. He could not afford to look at the sandbar. His whole world was the breech and the round and the rhythm. McCullough adjusted his aim a hand's width to the left, where the charge still surged forward, and fired again. The second cone of steel swept through another section of the column, and another gap tore open, and more men fell. 8 seconds had passed since the first shot, along the whole ridge. Now the Marine line had come alive. Rifles cracked in a ragged, endless roll. 2 more machine guns opened up, their tracers crossing over the sandbar in a lattice of fire. Mortar rounds began to fall out in the tree line, where the follow-on ranks were still spilling from the jungle. The narrow sandbar, the one piece of ground the Japanese had to cross, had become a funnel into a slaughter, but they came anyway. That was the thing Hightower would remember for the rest of his life. The thing that woke him at night for decades afterward. They came anyway, through the steel, through the tracers, through the bodies of their own dead. The men of the Ichiki detachment kept charging. Their courage was total, and it was useless. And the combination of those 2 things was the most terrible sight he had ever seen. Out on the sand, a Japanese lieutenant ran among his men with his sword raised over his head, screaming at them to press on, to close the distance, to reach the American line where numbers and cold steel would finally count for something. He felt the concussion of a canister round pass close enough to tear the sleeve of his uniform without touching his skin. He watched an entire section of his company disappear in a red mist. The precise formations he had drilled for weeks were dissolving into chaos in front of his eyes. And still he ran forward, because forward was the only direction his training had ever allowed. McCullough fired a 3rd round. This one caught a knot of soldiers who had bunched together as they tried to move around a pile of their fallen comrades. At that range, the steel balls struck with such force that some of the men were lifted off their feet before they crashed back down into the sand. McCullough was working now with a cold, mechanical rhythm, shifting his aim between shots to sweep different sections of the charge, and Miller fed the gun without pause. And the 2 of them became a single machine, a thing that existed only to load and aim and fire, but no line is ever perfect. And the thing about a funnel is that it channels men toward you as surely as it kills them. On the right of Hightower's position, where the ridge dipped into a patch of dead ground the anti-tank gun could not reach, a group of Japanese soldiers found the one path the steel balls did not cover, perhaps 40 of them, maybe more, screaming low to the ground, moving fast. They came up out of the dark space below the line before the rifleman there could react, and suddenly The fight was no longer a matter of range and firepower. It was hands and blades and boots in the mud. A Marine went down with a bayonet in his chest. Another swung his rifle like a club and felt it connect with bone. The neat geometry of the defense collapsed into something ancient and ugly. Men grappling in the dark, unable to tell friend from enemy except by the shape of a helmet or the sound of a scream. This was the moment the whole Banzai charge had been built to create. Break the line at a single point, get in among the defenders where firepower could not be brought to bear. Turn the battle into the kind of close, savage brawl where a determined man with a bayonet was worth as much as any machine. Hightower saw the break happen. He heard the change in the fighting on his right, the shift from the crack of rifles to the wet thud and grunt of men killing each other with their hands. For a sickening instant, he had to choose, turn the gun to the right and try to seal the breach and leave the sandbar open, or keep firing straight ahead into the main charge and trust the riflemen on the right to hold with steel and courage alone. He kept the gun on the sandbar. It was the hardest order he ever gave, and he gave it without a word, simply by not turning, because he understood the arithmetic of that night with a clarity that felt like ice. The 40 men in the breach could be fought. The 100 still crossing the sandbar could not be fought by anything except the gun. If the gun turned, the whole line would drown. So he left his own men to the knives and kept feeding the funnel into the cone of steel, and he hated himself for it, even as he knew it was right. McCullough fired again. And again, the barrel was growing hot now, hot enough to see in the dark, a dull red glow along the metal. That meant they were pushing the weapon past what it was built to endure. Between the crews, they had learned to fire in bursts of 3 or 4 rounds and then let the gun breathe. But there was no time to let it breathe now. Miller's gloves were smoking. His hands ached from the rhythm. Behind him, the 2 ammunition bearers in the shallow trench were passing rounds forward as fast as their arms would move, and the stack of canister was shrinking faster than any of them had planned for. That was the fear that lived underneath all the others. Not the charge, not the breach. The ammunition, each gun position held only 30 canister rounds and 20 armor-piercing shells, buried in waterproof cans near the pit. Resupply meant runners crawling 200 yards through the dark from the ammunition dump. Across ground, the enemy was raking with fire, carrying 2 heavy rounds at a time because that was all a man could hold. McCullough had done the math in training. He knew that a single gun, fired well, could break a company, but he also knew that the gun could only fire as long as the rounds kept coming. And out on that sandbar, there were not hundreds of men. There were closer to 1,000. The weapon itself was a small and unlovely thing to hold the fate of so many lives. It weighed only about 900 pounds. Light enough for 6 men to wrestle into a new position by hand. And its barrel was barely 3 inches across. It had been machined in an arsenal thousands of miles away by men who would never see this creek, men who had built it to stop tanks, and who could not have imagined the use it was being put to on this black strip of sand. And yet the idea inside it was as old as gunpowder. 2 centuries before, cannon crews had rammed their barrels full of loose iron shot and grape to break the ranks of charging infantry. The men who designed the M2 round had simply done the same thing with the precision of a modern factory, packing 122 steel balls of exact weight and size into a single case so that every shell would spread the same lethal cone in the same predictable way. History had circled all the way back to itself on this sandbar, and the men caught inside that circle did not have the time to notice. McCullough noticed nothing but the sight and the trigger. Miller noticed nothing but the breech and the round. And the war went on around them, 1 shell at a time. On the right, the breach was being sealed the hard way. A Marine sergeant had gathered a handful of men and thrown them into the gap, and they fought the infiltrators back yard by yard, trading blood for ground, The Japanese who had broken through had no support behind them, no second wave to exploit their success, because the second wave was dying on the sandbar under the cone of steel, and that was the whole tragedy of Colonel Ichiki's decision laid bare in a single patch of dead ground. His men had done the impossible. They had broken the line, and it did not matter because there were not enough of them to finish what they had started. He had attacked too soon, with too few, and now his soldiers were paying the full price of his pride. 2 miles to the west, Ichiki himself stood at his command post and watched the muzzle flashes stutter and flare across the distant sandbar. He listened to the sustained roar of American fire, a volume of firepower far beyond anything his intelligence officers had promised him. And slowly, the truth settled over him like cold water. His radio contact with the forward companies had gone silent minutes after the charge began. His officers were dead, or too busy fighting to live to answer. The assault that was supposed to sweep the Americans into the sea in a single night was breaking apart on a strip of sand 200 feet wide, and there was nothing he could do to call it back. The men were already committed. The men were already dying. Back at the gun, McCullough fired what he thought was his 7th round into a cluster of soldiers who had somehow pushed to within 70 yards of the line. At that close range, the steel balls held their full velocity and their tight spread, and the effect was beyond anything the human eye was meant to witness. Men did not fall so much as come apart. A single steel ball at that distance carried enough energy to pass clean through one body and strike the man behind. McCullough saw it happen, and he did not let himself see it. He shifted his aim and called for the next round, and Miller, God bless him, had it ready. The charge was faltering, not breaking, not yet, but faltering. The soldiers in the rear ranks had begun to reach the growing field of their own dead, and even the fiercest spirit falters when it must climb over the bodies of the men it trained beside to reach a wall of steel that has already killed everyone who went before. Some of them slowed, some of them stopped, some of them, for the first time in the history of the Pacific War, turned and looked back toward the jungle they had come from. The lieutenant with the sword did not turn back. He could not. He lay in the sand some 30 yards short of the American line, his weapon still gripped in his right hand, his body broken by steel balls that had torn through him as he ran. Around him, the men of his company crawled forward on their hands and knees, refusing, even now, to stop, dragging themselves toward an enemy they would never reach. It was not victory that drove them. Victory was already gone. It was something else, something Hightower could see even from behind his ridge, a devotion so complete and so misused that it made his throat close. Hour by hour, through that long night, the pattern repeated. A wave of screaming men would gather in the tree line and surge across the sandbar. The gun would find the range and open the cone of steel. The machine guns and the rifles would rake the survivors. The wave would break and fall back, leaving its dead behind, and for a few minutes there would be a silence broken only by the moaning of the wounded out on the sand. And then, impossibly, another wave would form, and the whole horror would begin again. McCullough lost count of the rounds somewhere after the 10th. His hands moved on their own. His mind had gone to a flat, gray place where there was only the sight and the trigger and the slap of Miller's hand on his shoulder. He no longer heard the individual screams. He heard only the great rolling noise of the battle, and under it, again and again, the sound he would carry for the rest of his life. The sound the steel balls made when they struck home, a vet tearing sound hundreds of times over, that no amount of years or distance would ever wash out of his dreams. Miller was down to the last few canister rounds in the pit. He shouted it out, his voice cracking, and one of the bearers went scrambling back into the dark toward the ammunition dump. crawling on his belly across 200 yards of fire-swept ground, with 2 more rounds cradled against his chest like a child. If he did not make it, the gun would fall silent. And if the gun fell silent, everything McCullough and Hightower and Miller had done through the long hours of that night would come undone in a matter of minutes. Because there were still men out there in the jungle, and they were still willing to charge. Hightower moved between the gun and the command telephone, checking the line, calling for the artillery further back to keep dropping shells on the tree line where the waves were forming. His voice was steady. He made certain his voice was steady because the men could hear it. And a shaking voice from an officer on a night like this could break a line faster than any bayonet. Inside, he was not steady at all. Inside, he was doing the arithmetic again, over and over, rounds against men, minutes against dawn. And every time he ran the numbers, they came out the same: hold, just keep the gun fed and keep the cone of steel closing across the sandbar and hold until the light came. Because in the light, the Japanese could no longer hide their numbers. And their numbers were all they had ever had. The bearer made it back. He rolled into the pit gasping, bleeding from a graze across his shoulder, and shoved 2 canister rounds into Miller's hands, and Miller seated one in the breech and slapped McCullough's shoulder, and the gun spoke again, out on the sandbar. The charge came on one more time, thinner now, more desperate. Men stumbling forward over a carpet of their own dead into the waiting cone of steel. McCullough found the range without thinking. The gun slammed back. The muzzle flash lit the sand, and in that flash, Hightower saw the whole terrible truth of the night written plain, across the ground in front of him. Hundreds of bodies, scattered in arcs and fans that traced the exact deadly geometry of the canister fire. A map, drawn in the fallen, of everything the 37mm gun had done. The Banzai charge, the tactic that had terrified the Pacific for a year, was dying on a strip of black sand at the mouth of a creek. Most of these men had never heard of a month before. And the darkness that had hidden its scale all night was at last beginning to gray toward dawn. Dawn did not come gently to Alligator Creek. It came gray and slow, the light bleeding up from behind the jungle and spreading across the water until, at last, it fell upon the sandbar and showed the men what they had done. Captain John Hightower climbed stiffly out of his position and stood at the edge of the ridge, and for a long moment he could not make his mind accept what his eyes were telling him. The sand was covered with the dead, not scattered, not here and there, but heaped in long curving rows that traced the exact arcs of the canister fire, as if some vast and careless hand had drawn the geometry of the gun across the ground in bodies. Close to 800 men of the Ichiki detachment lay across that narrow strip of sand and shallow water. The figure most often recorded afterward was 777. Hightower did not count them that morning. He could not have made himself count them. The guns had gone quiet. After the long roar of the night, the silence was almost worse. It was broken only by the soft hiss of the sea, the cries of gulls beginning to circle over the water, and here and there the low sound of a wounded man who had not yet died. Marine burial details moved out onto the sand in the early light, moving carefully, watching for the wounded who still held grenades, and doing their best not to look too closely at what the steel balls had done to flesh and bone. Some of them managed it. Some of them did not, and turned away and were sick in the grass behind the ridge. And no one said a word about it. Sergeant Eddie McCullough did not leave the gun. He sat behind it in the growing light, his hands finally still staring out at the field his weapon had made. The barrel had cooled from its dull red glow, but the metal still ticked faintly as it contracted, a small sound in the great silence. He had loaded and aimed and fired through the whole of that night, and he had done it well, and the doing of it well was the part he could not carry. He had studied the old battles. He had understood the mathematics of dispersion and velocity and range, but no equation had ever told him what it would feel like to be the man who worked the machine. Private Miller sat beside him, his smoke-stained gloves still on his hand, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing that either of them knew how to say out on the sand. Among the fallen, one soldier was still alive. He was young, no more than 20, and he lay where the second wave had broken, his rifle gone, his uniform dark with blood that was not all his own. He had crossed China in another man's story and had come to this island believing what he had been taught, that the spirit of the emperor's soldiers could overcome any weapon, any wall, any barrier of steel. He had run into the cone of fire with that belief bright and whole in his chest, and now it was leaking out of him along with everything else. And in its place, there was only a boy far from home, cold in the morning air, looking up at a sky that did not care which flag he had died for. A Marine found him there. The Marine did not raise his rifle. The two of them looked at each other across a distance that no war had ever managed to close. The victor and the dying, and for one moment there was no Banzai charge and no Henderson Field and no emperor and no republic. There was only two young men, and one of them was leaving. The Japanese soldier's lips moved. No sound came. The Marine crouched beside him and stayed because it was the only decent thing left to do. And he stayed until the boy was gone. Then he stood up and wiped his face with the back of his hand and went to help the others with the terrible work of the morning. That was the thing the stories never told. The stories spoke of a myth being shattered, of a tactic being broken, of American steel triumphing over Japanese spirit. All of that was true, but it was also true that every one of those bodies on the sand had been a man with a mother somewhere, and a name, and a reason he believed in enough to die for. Hightower knew that. McCullough knew it. It was the knowing that made them quiet for the rest of their lives. Whenever anyone asked them about Guadalcanal, 2 miles to the west, at his command post, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki received the reports as the morning sun climbed above the trees, and the reports confirmed the ruin of everything he had built. 3 companies had been destroyed. Only a handful of men had crawled back out of the dark to tell him what had waited for them on the sandbar. They spoke, those survivors, of a weapon unlike anything they had faced in China or the Philippines, a gun that threw clouds of steel balls and cut down dozens of men with a single shot. Ichiki had gambled his detachment on the belief that spirit would be enough. He had attacked too soon, with too few against an enemy he had not troubled to understand. Now the price of that gamble lay strewn across the sand in the morning light. Ichiki did not survive the destruction of the force he had led. He died there on Guadalcanal with the men he had ordered forward, and the manner of his death has been told more than one way, but the fact of it has never been in doubt. What died on that sandbar was larger than one detachment or one colonel, or one long and terrible night. What died was an idea. For a year, the Banzai charge had worked not because it was wise, but because no enemy had yet brought the right weapon and the right nerve to the right piece of ground at the same time. On the western bank of Alligator Creek, the Americans had done exactly that, and the result would ripple outward through the rest of the war. Word of the new weapons spread through the Japanese units across the Solomon Islands, carried by the survivors, whispered from man to man. 3 weeks later, at a place the Marines came to call Edson's Ridge, the story would repeat itself, guns loaded with canister, tearing apart another assault in a matter of minutes. And slowly, battle by battle, the great human wave attacks that had once broken armies began to lose their terror, because the men who were asked to make them had begun to understand that courage alone could not carry a soldier through a cone of steel. There was a lesson in it that reached far beyond the jungle. The 37mm gun had been built to kill tanks. It had been turned into something else by men who were willing to look at a familiar weapon and ask what else it might do. That willingness, the readiness to abandon the manual when the manual no longer fit the fight, was a kind of strength that no amount of spirit could match. The enemy had trusted in tradition, in the belief that the way things had always been done was the way they must always be done. The Americans on that sandbar had trusted in adaptation, and in the end it was not the larger heart or the fiercer devotion that decided the night. It was the ability to turn a defensive necessity into a killing advantage through nothing more than imagination and a case full of steel. Hightower stood on the ridge until the sun was full up over the water. The burial details worked below him. The gulls turned overhead. Somewhere behind the line, a corpsman was tending the few Marines who had been wounded in the breach, and their number was small, terribly small, against the field of the enemy dead. That imbalance was the whole story of the night in a single glance. Determination had met engineering, and engineering had won, and the cost of the winning had been paid almost entirely by the men who charged. McCullough finally rose from the gun. He ran one hand along the cool barrel, the way a man might touch something he was not sure he wanted to understand, and then he let his hand fall. He would fire that weapon many more times before the war was over, on other islands, against other charges. He would become very good at it, and being good at it would never once feel like anything to be proud of. Years afterward, long after the guns had gone quiet for good, he would still wake in the dark to that same wet, tearing sound, the sound the steel balls made when they found their mark. And he would lie there in the safety of a peacetime bed and listen to it until the morning came. Some sounds do not leave. Some nights a man carries for the rest of his life, whether he wins them or not. The change did not stop at Guadalcanal. In the months that followed, the lessons of that sandbar traveled up through the ranks and out across the whole of the Pacific. Ordnance men in distant arsenals studied the reports and began designing canister rounds for larger guns, shells that carried not 122 steel balls, but 200, 300 and more, so that the wall of steel could be thrown wider and farther against any charge that dared to come. Officers who had once feared the Banzai attack above all else now understood that it could be answered, that there was a range and a weapon and a moment of nerve that could break the charge before it ever reached the line. The fear began slowly to change sides, and on the Japanese side, the change was just as real, though it was measured in silence rather than in manual. The survivors carried their story back to their units, and the story spread, and men who had once run toward the guns without a flicker of doubt began, here and there, to hesitate, not from cowardice. These were not cowards, but from the dawning knowledge that spirit alone could no longer carry a man across open ground into the teeth of American firepower. Something that had seemed eternal had been shown to have an end, and once a thing has been shown to have an end, it can never again be quite what it was. The battle at the mouth of Alligator Creek would go into the histories as a turning point, one of the first clear proofs that the tide in the Pacific had begun to shift. Generals would study it. Training manuals would be rewritten to teach a new generation of gunners how to load and aim the deadly canister rounds. The myth of the unstoppable Japanese soldier, the myth that had haunted every Marine on the island, had been broken on that strip of sand, and it would never fully recover. But for the three men behind the gun, it was never really about turning points, or manuals, or myths. It was about a single night and the sound of 1,000 men screaming a word they did not understand, and the terrible weight of the choice to hold their fire until the range was right. They had done their duty. They had held the line, and they had learned on the western bank of a jungle creek the oldest and hardest truth of war, that victory and horror can wear the very same face, and that sometimes the men who win a battle spend the rest of their lives trying to forget how they did it. The sea washed against the sand, patient and indifferent, and slowly, gently, began to reach for the fallen